you've seen the title, you know what we're doing. The worst unit in every single Fire Emblem game. So let's just dive straight into it. But not before I've quickly made clear that I will not be accounting for any specific challenges in this video. Low turn challenges, Iron Man challenges, all of it is not kept into consideration here, nor is any specific difficulty. With that said, let's get the ball rolling in Arcania for Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, the original game from 1990. Because yes, there is a huge difference in unit quality between the originals and the remakes, and so we are looking at both separately. The first ever Fire Emblem game is not exactly a treasure trove of powerful fighters, I think it's fair to say. In fact, I would say there are significantly more weak units in this game than there are powerful ones. Naming them all would simply take too long, and we have 3 more Arcania games to tackle too, so I'll just explain to you instead why Beck is the absolute bottom of the barrel. He's a ballistician, a rare class that comes pre-packaged with a ballista as their weapon. That may sound like a quite useful thing, as they can shoot faraway targets, but no, not in this game. Here, a ballista does the exact same thing as an archer, having a range of 2, which, combined with a movement of only 4, makes them effectively a worse version of a class that is already not exactly amazing. They balance this out with much better defenses than an archer has, but probably the easiest way to make sure Beck is an attack is by just not using him. Furthermore, Beck has some of the worst base stats in the entire game, doesn't join until chapter 13, which is halfway through the game, and as a cherry on top, he is completely unusable in his recruitment chapter. So, Beck is recruited by visiting a village, like many units are, but because this one is surrounded by mountain tiles, which a ballistician can't cross, he cannot leave this little space he's recruited in. It's honestly the perfect first impression for one of the worst units the series has ever seen. For how early in the series Gaiden is, I actually think that it is a surprisingly good job of making every unit somewhat useful. Even characters that join at surprisingly low levels, like Sonya, can make for useful additions simply because the roster of this game is so limited, and the chapter design, let's call it unconventional. I would say the worst of a redeemable bunch is Atlas though. His strength and HP are clearly the highlights, but beyond that, there's not a lot to love. No villager joins later than him, which is not ideal despite him still being a relatively early joiner, and the rest of his stats are frankly abysmal. He's not a liability, you can have him tag along just fine, but you'll be high pressed to have a run of Gaiden where Atlas is your best unit, or frankly, not just the worst version of a different unit. It's back to Arcania for Mystery of the Emblem, where Beck has found himself out of last place. He's still not elite or anything, but he's certainly not the worst anymore. All thanks to the fact he isn't in the game. So his questionable title now goes to Sheena, which is a shame because she's one of the few units in this game who actually has a bit of story prevalence. She's a very late addition to your army, chapter 17 to be exact, although her stats suggest she should be joining much earlier. They're just flat out not good, save for her high defense, which is not as useful as it sounds due to the fact most enemies from this point on are either magic users or dragons who do whatever the hell they want and ignore defense entirely. So yeah, had she joined early in the game, she probably would have avoided appearing in this video. But in her current form, I'm afraid she doesn't weigh up. On to Genealogy of the Holy War, where we find another one of the most baffling units this series has ever seen. He listens to the name of Hannibal and almost feels like he was deliberately created to troll the player. Not only is he a very late addition to your army, he's an absolute nightmare to recruit in the first place. You need to keep him alive long enough for you to reach the castle Kuiper is held in and then have them talk. That may sound doable, but it's a lot more difficult than it looks. Hannibal loves a suicide move or two. And what do you get in reward for this annoying ordeal? The worst unit in the game. Hannibal is a pre-promoted late game in general with abysmal growths and decent base stats. They could definitely be worse. However, as a general, his movement is obviously terrible, and in the enormous maps FE4 throws at you, that makes him borderline unusable, save for perhaps guarding a castle or something. But really, your army should have evolved past the point of needing Hannibal at this point in the game. And while he may be the worst thing Genealogy of the Holy War has to offer, I wouldn't say Hannibal is the worst unit in Jugdrawl. That honor goes to Shannon, with an M, from Thracia 776, a unit that almost feels purposefully terrible to further highlight he is supposed to be an imposter pretending to be someone else. His base stats are bad, his growth rates are bad, his weapon rank is bad, and despite being a sword master, you'll find he'll barely hit any crits because his FCM or PCC, his follow-up critical multiplier, is 0. To very quickly explain what that means, it's a hidden stat for Thracia that affects how high your crit chance is on second hits. Since Shannon's is 0, that means he cannot hit a critical on his second attack. As a sword master, yeah, that's bad. It is very fitting that the game with probably the weakest lord in Fire Emblem history, Sir Roy of Binding Blade, also has some of the worst units this entire series has ever seen. To the point Roy isn't even in consideration, despite being a force deploy while being quite poor. Instead, we are to witness a rare mid-off between Gwendolyn, also known as Wendy, and Sophia. Both have absolutely abysmal base stats, join severely underleveled, and are easily outclassed by others. In Sophia's case, that's really just any magic user like Nime, while for Wendy that's every cavalier in your army, since knights and calves share the same promotion item. While the growth rates of both aren't too horrible, they're simply not worth the investment. Sophia's biggest boon is finding a guiding ring in the sand of her recruitment chapter, while Gwendolyn's only real pro compared to Sophia is that she joins earlier, meaning the chances of you actually being able to use her growths are at least a little bigger. I would say that from a pure power level, Sophia is the worst Binding Blade has to offer, but Wendy is the less useful addition to your army, so honestly, both are perfectly fine winners for this questionable award. My pick would be Sophia though, personally. Next time we visit a leap in Blazing Blade, we don't find another unit as bad as Sophia and Wendy, I would say, although one definitely sticks out as a completely useless addition. And I'm sorry to say, Fire Emblem heroes lie to you. Carla isn't useful or noteworthy, she's just bad. Not only is she recruited in a bizarre manner you have no way of knowing without looking it up beforehand, she also joins in chapter 31, meaning there are at most 3 chapters to go still. Not that it matters, because her stats for this point in the game are genuinely terrible. She will legit struggle to kill anything. Part of that has to do with her being a sword master, which may be very cool, but is definitely not among the best classes in the game, and I would wager that if you decided you wanted to keep one of them in your army up until this point, the role is already given to either Carol or Lynn. Carla ends up feeling more like a little Easter egg or secret as opposed to a viable unit you're actually intended to recruit. She offers that little to your army. Next up, Sacred Stones, which is such an easy game, it really doesn't have any units that are truly unusable. Standing steadfast at the bottom of my list though is Amelia, who is probably the best example of one of my most hated archetypes. A growth unit who ends up being no more than average. As is typical of a trainee, Amelia starts out being terrible, but it seems like somewhere along the way, IS forgot they're supposed to give such a character good growths. Amelias are pretty average, all things considered, and so she ends up being no more than an okay unit, no matter what you turn her into. At her final form, she's not unusable, she's not even a liability, but she definitely never warranted the investment you gave her, during days where she undoubtedly was a liability. Other growth units like Ewan and Nami definitely provide some competition for Amelia, cause they're hardly worth their investment either, but I would say Amelia is one tier below them still, especially because inexperienced players are unlikely to have her become useful. Path of Radiance is in a similar place to Sacred Stones, where the game is so easy there aren't really any units that feel out of place. Well, there is one exception, Rolf. I don't know what the plan was here, but Rolf has fully been set up to fail. He has stats that would be okay-ish in like chapter 1 or 2, but instead he doesn't join until chapter 9, with a terrible weapon rank of E to boot. And that's as an archer, which makes him largely unusable on enemy turns, and only particularly useful in the one chapter in the early game that features flying enemies. Rolf isn't unredeemable, Path of Radiance is easy enough that you can have him tag along if you really want, but from every usable metric, I can't do anything else but call him the worst unit in Path of Radiance. Compared to its predecessor, Radiant Dawn is a different beast entirely. Not only is it significantly more difficult, it also has several units that are just flat out terrible. And one reigns supreme as not just the worst character in the game, but arguably the entire series as a whole, Liar. She's Left's sister and a cat Lagoose, which is already a bit of a problem since it means she only really gets experience when she isn't transformed. Not ideal for a growth unit. Even less ideal is the fact that her base stats are abysmal and her growth rates as well, meaning she's likely to end up worse than Lev in literally every way, even if you decide to throw all the available experience at Liar. That's how bad she is. Not that you'll ever get to that anyway, since Liar basically does no damage and is not killing anyone you didn't leave at 1 HP. Oh, and did I mention that not too long after she joins, Renolf, a much better cat Lagoose, is a forced deployment? It says enough that Liar is considered to be lower ranked than Kai'Sa, who is already terrible to begin with. Remake time now, starting of course with Shadow Dragon on DS. This game retains the updates done to Ballisticians from Mystery of the Emblem, meaning Beck is once again in the clear. In fact, many units in Shadow Dragon have received considerable buffs to their stats, which mostly put them up to standards with modern day Fire Emblem. There is however one exception. Kamikaze enthusiast Lawrence retains his pretty solid stats from the NES, and what once made him a perfectly fine middle of the road unit now leads to a bottom tier one. After all, he is supposed to be a tank, someone who can be thrown into enemy range and survive, but with his current stats compared to buffed up foes, he simply doesn't fulfill his purpose anymore. Only if you reclass him is he still somewhat useful, but let's be real, who is going to do that out of their own volition? When looking at New Mystery of the Emblem, the last ever Japanese exclusive Fire Emblem game, I assume, we find what is probably the worst unit the series has ever seen. This game's version of Bantu is just something special in the worst way. While he originally started as a pretty decent unit in the original Shadow Dragon, he has devolved to becoming one of the weakest abominations that has ever been on our side. His base stats are an all-time low point in the series, including his HP, which creates the insane situation that Bantu might actually just die before you ever get the chance to reach and recruit him on higher difficulties. Not that you're missing much, obviously, because while he once was your ticket to Tiki, that purpose has also been taken from him. Even if you funnel him every experience point and stat booster you can get, he will still end up among the worst units in your army, guaranteed. That's how weak this crusty old Manakete is. And as such, I think it's fair to say bad units went out with a bang. Because from Awakening onwards, the truly terrible unit honestly kinda dies out. With the amount of customization this game introduced, every unit can be made usable with the right kit. And while I guess that also means you can make everyone terrible with the wrong kit, who in their right mind is doing that? So yeah, no more Bantus, Sophias and Liars, but of course there must always be a unit the worst of them all, even if they're still decent enough in a vacuum. For Awakening, my vote would go to Virion, which is a shame since he's quite a noteworthy character who gets plenty of story attention as well. But as a unit, he's not ideal. At the risk of repeating myself, archers aren't the lead to begin with. And what doesn't help is that Virion's defense is among his worst stats, making him especially frail in a game with so many enemies and random reinforcements that keeping a unit out of harm's way is not exactly easy. Compared to his fellow shepherds, his skills are not among the best either, further hurting his kit and making him not the ideal parent for many of the kits you plan on using. Again, if your Virion turned out to be the hero of your run, I immediately believe you, he definitely can be, like everyone else in Awakening, but on average, I would put him at the bottom of the list. Next up, Fates. This is obviously a very tricky game to judge, considering which route you play factors in quite a lot, so I figured I'd pick one unit for Fates as a whole and one for Revelation, since that is a route where basically all units are playable and is thus the easiest to compare. For Revelation, my vote would go to Odin. He isn't exactly the best unit in Conquest to begin with, but he joins way too late to warrant his stat spread in the Revelation route. Keep in mind, his bases are only marginally better at this point than they are when he joins in Conquest, and in that game he joins in Chapter 8 versus 17 in Revelation. That said, Odin is not bad enough in Conquest to end up as the worst unit in Fates, period. That title I would give to Mozu. And the reason for that is basically the same as it was for Amelia. She isn't a terrible unit, but a unit designed for growth that only ends up being about average is just such an annoying trope that I would never recommend adding her to your team. Once again, Motsu isn't unusable, she has pretty decent skills and can use terrain in quite unique ways, but compared to the legion of monster units Fates gives you access to, she ends up feeling a tad unremarkable. And then we have Heroes. Yes, Heroes. IS considers it a mainline game for some reason, and mostly I find it very interesting to look into which of these 1000+ heroes is the absolute worst. And man, that was not easy to uncover. So many units that were once solid, albeit unspectacular, have become completely useless over the years. So what I went looking for was a unit from the first few years of the game that was terrible even back then. So many names came up, to the point I began to wonder whether IS even realized what made a good hero in the first few years. But I would say the absolute bottom of the barrel is Spring Xander. Attack, low. Speed, low. Skill, low. This guy has never been able to deal damage, and he can't support or tank either. Even if you fill him up with the most ridiculous skills you can find, Spring Xander won't become usable. Him being poor today is excusable. Him being weak the day he came out is ridiculous. And next, Echo's Shadows of Valentia, the final remake left to go, where Atlas is no longer the weakest unit, I would say. His stats have been improved somewhat, not massively, but enough to take better advantage of his many class options. So we have a new worst unit for Echoes, who, keep it in mind, is definitely not a bad unit whatsoever. But the fact of the matter is that Forsyth just doesn't really weigh up. He joins a tad underleveled compared to the rest of the Deliverance, especially his fellow soldier Lucas, and while he does have better growths and will eventually outperform him, the thing here is that as a knight, he will never really become useful. Forsyth is a decent wall, who doesn't get obliterated by the opposition, but all he can really do to help is occasional chip damage, cause he simply doesn't hit hard enough and lacks the movement to really run with the front lines. Now, obviously the same problems plague Lucas, but he is much better in the early game, and so my vote goes to Forsyth. Onto free houses, which doesn't exactly decrease the amount of wild customization you can do, I think it's fair to say. As such, this game truly doesn't have any bad units. Just reclass anyone who's underperforming into a Wyvern Rider and lo and behold, they're good now. But, just like with Awakening, there are still some units who, on average, will turn out to be less useful than their classmates, and that's the one we're after here. For example, Lawrence, it's in the name, and Caspar are definitely not the best the Golden Deer and Black Eagles have to offer, but I would say the worst unit of free houses is a Blue Lion, Ashe. As an archer-coded character, Ashe is quite frail and makes for a better utility unit than a strong fighter. Once upon a time, that alone would have been enough to save you from being the worst. See the complete lack of healers and thieves in this video, but in free houses, literally everyone can become a utility unit, including those that are much stronger than Ashe. His personal ability Lockpick allows him to open chests no matter what class he is, but the thing is, not only can literally every character in the game become a thief and get the ability that way, you can also just buy keys by the dozen in free houses after literally the first chapter in the game. Give Dimitri or Byleth a couple of keys and you have Ashe's entire niche covered by a much stronger combat unit. Again though, let me be clear, Ashe is not a bad unit and can even become an absolute monster with the right kit, but literally everyone in free houses can. In most playthroughs, he will instead be the one spending his time on the sideline, I would wager. And finally we have Engage, a game that makes things even more difficult than ever before, because while making units good in Awakening, Fates and free houses at least requires picking out a good kit for them, in Engage you can just hand them some ridiculous emblem ring, engrave their weapon and have a solid if not amazing unit right then and there. If we take those out of the equation, however, we do find a small group of stragglers that are perfectly serviceable, but definitely among the worst in the roster. My top two candidates would be Bunei and Lapis. Let's start with the latter, which is really a bit of an unfortunate case. Lapis isn't bad, she's pretty decent actually, but she is so utterly outclassed by both Kagetsu and Goldmary that end up joining only a little later that you really can't warrant keeping her on your team unless you really want to use her. Purely looking at unit quality in a vacuum, she's probably better than Bunei, who I would wager is the weakest unit in the game from that perspective, with unremarkable stats and a very questionable personal skill. But he at least fits a role that is less common, and the game doesn't hand you two much better replacements a few chapters later. But I guess this entire video has been about the worst unit in the game and not the least useful unit in the game, so by that metric, my vote goes to Bunei at the end of the day. And that has been all of them. Who do you consider the worst units in Fire Emblem? Share it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on all my future Fire Emblem content coming up. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.